You can give me a green light. I'm good. Okay. So welcome everyone. My pleasure to introduce today's speakers. So Frithjof Lutscher, Prof at University of Ottawa in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. You do both? Or yeah?
I don't, but our department does.
Okay, yeah, the department does. And you have a joint appointment with biology.
Yes.
At the University of Ottawa. So Frithjof is I've had the pleasure to collaborate with Frithjof. If there's any semi-rigorous math in any of my papers, it's thanks to him. Otherwise, don't read. So Frithjof has done a lot of work in mathematical ecology, mathematical biology, working on the range expansion of species, so spatial dynamics. He's the author of a big book, The Authority on Integral Difference Equations in spatial ecology. And he's all over the place in Canada. He's the recipient of the CAMBAM Research Award in 2022. That was, I'm good, right? Yeah, good. I know you. And you drove this one. So will be great. So Frithjof had to change. I don't know if your talk is not going to be a career-spanning talk, so it might be more about your more recent interest that I know less about in phenology, but just to say that this research is very broad in spatial dynamics in general, ecology. So over to you. Okay.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. So indeed, I am going to talk about this, and this is somehow related to what was in the abstract, but it's not entirely what I wrote in the abstract, because I wrote the abstract first and then thought about what I want to talk about, not the other way around. So sorry about that. But there will be overlap between what's in the abstract and what I'm talking about. Okay, so I want to talk about how phenology affects consumer resource dynamics, but first, I'll give 3 seconds to find where we are. I'm acknowledging, yeah, okay, good. I'm acknowledging that I'm on unceded territory and on land of people who have been here long before I have been guardians of this land long before I showed up here. So Montreal is a bit easier to find because of the rivers. Try to find Ottawa. It's kind of, okay. So what is phenology? Phenology is the timing of life cycle events within a year or within the life cycle of the organism. And there are many reasons why that could be important. Right? So this image here comes from a paper or from a book chapter, Cushing in 1990. He was looking at fish populations in the North Atlantic. And he says, over time, at some point there are the eggs coming, and then these eggs develop into larvae, and then these larvae need to feed. And so the larval food can either have what he called a close match with the larvae, or it can have a big mismatch with the larvae. He said if there's a big mismatch, then the larvae will mostly get no food and hence not develop, and hence the populations plummet. And if there is a nice match, then the population should be doing fine. So that was part of why do fish populations in the North Atlantic fluctuate in the second half of the 20th century. That didn't catch a lot of attention outside of his work at the time. And then much later, when people became a lot more aware of climate change, things picked up. So there's a different paper, a similar idea of these kind of distributions of individuals. So here is a temperature distribution. And if climate warming makes this wider, can you see that? Makes this wider, then that means in some sense a growing season should be longer and it should be better for the population. Population size should go up. If this is precipitation, so precipitation could be more frequent, extending a growing season, population goes up. Could be less frequent, decreasing a growing season, population could go down. This is a very conceptual paper. There's not a model behind that, but those are the ideas that are floating around. To the point that some people call this a ticking time bomb. So this paper is from 2020, and they looked at the interaction between birds, great tits in the UK, and their main source of food, caterpillars, at a certain time of year when the birds have their young and they need a lot of food to feed their young. And so we have this going on where you need to have a match between the food availability and the energy intake. And at the same time, you have this going along where temperature changes and climate changes, and the larvae, sorry, the little birds might hatch at a different time when the caterpillars are available because they might go by different cues. And then maybe what used to be a match is becoming a mismatch, and then the birds will go. Right? So this is why this could be a time bomb. Other people have looked at that like closer to home, spruce budworm, something that destroys forests in this province and others. And they said, well, with the different climates that we can expect and phenological changes, it's possible that the spruce budworm goes into trees that were so far protected just because the timing wouldn't work out, right? The budworm came out and the trees didn't have their new needles yet, and so there was no food, so the budworm wouldn't go there, but that could change. And then there is a review paper that says, well, yes, we know that there are consequences when the climate shifts, but really most of the systems don't seem to react very strongly to that. So this paper basically says, we haven't found a lot of really strong impacts. So all of that calls for a lot of math modeling, but we can look either very specifically or what I will do, a bit more abstract, more general, to see what can happen, what different mechanisms are. So that's where I want to take you on that kind of journey. So first question is, how do we put phenology into mathematical models in the first place? And then what happens if we do? Can we get interesting mathematics out? Can we get interesting ecology out? There are many, many ways of approaching this. What these guys have done is a very complex model. It's not an individual-based simulation, but it's a very complex model that includes genetics and population dynamics, all kinds of things. I'm starting at the bottom, at the other end of things. I'm starting with stuff that I can write down the equations, and I can do a little bit of analysis, and I can something simple that I understand. So classical approaches for consumer resource dynamics. We always need a consumer and a resource because we're interested in a match between the two, right? So there will always be these two in my talk. Classical approaches, you would write down two differential equations, the black part here. So I've written down, this is a very simple Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. And then what you do, you need to put somehow temperature dependence in there. So you can make any of the parameters temperature dependent, which means time dependent. And because it's temperature within a year, it's periodic. You've got many, many choices. That's great. You can write many papers on that without ever understanding the biology. Or you can really look for what these things do in terms of time, in terms of temperature. Then you've got a huge demand on data to find anything that's important about your parameters. So that's not easy to even write down the correct functions. The analysis is definitely not easy because now you have time periodic systems and a lot of like all the steady state analysis goes out of the window, right? Cushing did that in 1977, a different Cushing from the one I mentioned earlier. This is the mathematician. So he worked some on that, and then Kuznetsov et al. Did really the definite bifurcation analysis on the system. So stuff can be done. It's not easy. I'm not sure how insightful it is, other than like here, for example, you can get all kinds of weird bifurcations from this. But what comes back when you do this all the time over and over is you have to ask yourself life cycle questions. What's the organism that you're modeling? Where are you putting your temperature dependence, and how does it go? For example, a growth rate. Is that really positive all throughout the year? Do these individuals reproduce all throughout the year? If I look outside, maybe not, right? So most insects don't reproduce right now. Way too cold. So then if it's going to be 0 for part of the year, and then how are we going to treat it? Or some of the organisms I'll be looking at later, or 2 slides from now, they have what is called a birth pulse. So they reproduce over a very short period of the entire year. Do we really model? Is this really the best way of modeling that? So life cycle questions mean is this a good model? And it also means you're getting more and more specific about the organisms that you model. You're not as general anymore as with just, write down any lot-coupled terror system. So there's a balance choice that you need to make. Okay. Because this is time periodic, yearly periodic, you could say, let's forget about this. Let's just go to models that go from one year to the next. We don't need to know all the details in between. Let's just do this in discrete time. We know we can project from one year to the next, and we have studied consumer resource models like that, in particular in the case of insects, since 1935. And then we have to have somehow an effect of seasonality in there. We don't quite know what it is, but somehow that has to go in there. So any one of the parameters could theoretically be dependent on how long the summer was that year or how hot the winter was or whatever. So that's the big question here. We don't know how to do that. Again, parameter data demands, but the analysis all of a sudden is not any harder than before we put the P in, right? This is still a two-dimensional discrete dynamical system. It doesn't change from something simple to something complicated, because when we look at the periodic map, what is a steady state is still a steady state. So that part is easier. And again, we ask ourselves life cycle questions like, okay, so growth rate, when does it come in? How much should it depend on this or that? So what I read the paper in 2008, no, a paper that was published in 2008, that somehow combines the best of the two worlds, as far as I'm concerned, for those things. Because it looks in more detail at the life cycle. So in this case, we have a consumer that has a birth pulse in the year, like I said earlier, right? So a very short period in the year where the species reproduces. And we have a resource that grows more or less all the time. So think of, let's say, a herbivore, spruce bark worm, an insect that reproduces, lays eggs at a very specific time of year, but then it eats green stuff mostly, and that can reproduce all year long. Or bigger herbivores and grass bushes, all that kind of thing. Or even other resources that, like hares, have several litters per year. So that's close to continuous, right? And then you just model these processes separately. So during the year, after reproduction, there is no more consumer growth. So the consumers decline because they die, because they get eaten, whatever. The resource grows logistically here, and it's being eaten by the consumer. And then the consumer stores the resource that it has eaten until the next reproduction event. So we need to have a third compartment, I call energy here. So this is the energy per consumer. So that's what each consumer stores. And then at the next birth event, the energy gets set to 0. And the consumers that were there survive. And then there's the energy that they had stored that gets transformed by a factor of theta into new consumers. And the resource just stays the same at that point. So I haven't done much. I've just changed the life cycle from the consumer to just being constant, like having an ODE where all processes happen at the same time, to have a consumer that has a well-defined birth pulse. As I said, this was the paper by Paszewski et al. In ecology, and I find this is one of the undercited and underrated papers because I think it does a lot of really great things. One of the things it does is it turns out that this system is just at the perfect level that you can explicitly solve it and go from this semi-discrete formulation to an actual discrete model. So you can, if I got that here, you can write this down and derive this explicitly from it. And that's what it looks like. So you say the resource and the consumer at the beginning of year n, I denote as my two variables, Vn and Wn. And then I can say V the next year and W the next year, how they depend on V current year and W current year. So I can write down explicitly these maps F and G. And they look horribly complicated. That's okay. There will be a test at the end of the talk about this, and you remember them all. But they look horribly complicated. And I've highlighted in red where the V goes in, and in the blue where the W goes in. Could you have guessed that? No, of course not. Nobody could, right? But that's the power of saying, let's start on that level that we're interested in and derive the exact equations rather than start at that level and then heuristically put in how the season length should go into all of this, right? So we start here, we can explicitly solve. It turns out we can do more. We can find steady states of this thing. So we can solve this for V and for W explicitly. It's surprising, but it works. And once you have all of that, you can study dynamics. You can do a bifurcation diagram, for example, like this. Consumer mortality increasing in this direction, attack rate increasing in that direction. So if the attack rate is very low, you get consumer extinction. The resource goes to 1, the consumer goes to 0. I guess I have some colors wrong here. I'm sorry about that. If you have a high enough attack rate, then you get stable coexistence between the consumer and the resource. And by stable coexistence, I mean you look at your once-a-year map. You don't look in between the season, you just look once a year. And then if the attack rate gets higher, you can either get consumer resource cycles, so the density goes up over a couple of years and goes down over a couple of years, or you can get overcompensation cycle, where 1 year you're high, the other year you're low, or you can get chaos. This is not my work, as I said, this goes back to Przewski, but it's a model where you can really look at what the season length and all these other things do. So that's the model that inspired me. Say, okay, I want to build on that because the fact that it's explicitly solvable and this kind of clean structure, I want to put in true seasonality. So far there has been, the year has been only by the consumer birth pulse. That was the only thing that came in. But I want to put summer and winter. And there could be stage structure, because juveniles may react differently to summer and winter temperatures than adults. And then potentially a differential resting phase. So the start of summer is not the same for all species, right? They come out of dormancy at different times of year. So I'll do that in the second step. And then at the end, I'll hope to talk about something like coming from the other end. If you really start with climate data, can we do this initial, more analytical approach and something like that and get somewhere in the middle where they meet? So seasonality. I now have a summer and a winter period. And I'm extending the Przewski model just a little bit. This part here is the same as what I just explained. And in the winter, well, the consumer just declines. There's no resource. The resource declines. There's nothing to grow. And the energy stored, well, different assumption. You can say either it stays constant or you can say it declines as well. It doesn't matter for the analysis very much. So the simpler case is this. At reproduction, the same thing occurs. The energy gets set to 0. The energy gets transformed into new consumers. And now I can play with the length of the summer and the relative length of the winter as a very simple thing. And I can talk about seasonality. So the cool thing about this is despite this extension, we can still do everything that they were able to do with their simpler model. We can still get the explicit year-to-year map. We can still solve explicitly for what the steady states are and can get the same bifurcation type diagrams that we have. So this is the same kind of bifurcation diagram that you've seen. There's the consumer death rate here. There's the attack rate here. Below the blue line, we have extinction on the consumer. They just can't eat enough. They die too much. Then in between these lines, we have a stable coexistence state. Above the red line, we get consumer resource cycles. So we get this kind of thing. And at the black line, we go into the up-down, the fold bifurcation if you're a mathematician, or flip bifurcation. And so what happens is, if we make the summer longer, we get more of these complex dynamics. And if we make the summer shorter, we get very little of these complex dynamics. And in particular, these overcompensation cycles are completely gone from the picture. And so why is that the case? If you make longer summers, of course, you also have more growth of the resource. So there is more food for the consumer that can drive its growth so it can outgrow its resource. Longer summers also give more interaction time. So in some sense, there's this principle of interaction strength that says the higher the interaction strength, the more likely you are to destabilize a consumer resource system. So this is one of the first things. I'd say shorter summers typically should lead to more stable populations. It can also lead to more extinction. Right? So either the zero state or the coexistence state are more stable in some sense. These particular plots are done with the assumption that the winter mortality is lower than the summer mortality. We made that because we were interested in hibernators at this point, and for hibernators, winter mortality is low. That's why they hibernate, right? They go, they shut down all their body functions, and they find a safe place where the predators can't come in, ideally. So mortality is lower. But then when you think about these hibernators a little bit more and read some of the literatures, you find that there is more involved. So here are two examples. Little brown bats and these ground squirrels there. These guys have smaller litter size. In fact, litter size is 1 and have a longer lifespan. They can live up to 7 or 8 years in the wild. These have a larger litter size, but they don't live quite as long. And so we have a faster life history and a slower life history. And that's one of the questions in biology. Which of the two species, which of the two life histories can do better under climate change? Which can adapt better? So we said, well, let's try it out with our model. But then you look at this, and one of the interesting things here is that for both of these species, is that the juveniles benefit from warmer winters, but the adults don't. And that has to do with their metabolic rates during hibernation. If it's too warm, the adults wake up every now and then, and it costs energy. But if it's warm enough for the juveniles, then it doesn't cost them enough, so too much energy to be in this kind of resting state. So we needed to split up juvenile and adult stages. I didn't put the equations in anymore because I think they're clear. If I give you half an hour, you could write them down, but then you don't have to. But what happens is resource grows and gets consumed during the summer and dies during the winter. The adult consumers have the birth increase. The birth comes into the juveniles, but they mature after 1 year. So this is when the adult consumers increase, and they die during the summer, they die during the winter, and then maturation replenishes the adults. The juveniles get born at the beginning of summer, and then they die, and they die. Go up. So we now have 4 equations per season, right? The resource, the adult consumer, the energy that they store for reproduction, and the juvenile consumers. We can still get explicit expressions for the year-to-year map. They got more complicated, longer integrals, but still possible, and we can still find the steady states. And then at some point, we'll talk a little bit later, we can relate the mean monthly temperature to season length. Right? So how long is a season? Well, pick your favorite sine curve, and you have a mean, and say, if it's above that degree, then I have summer. If it's below that degree, then it's winter. So the first thing we did is, again, the same. You can see a theme here, right? The same type of bifurcation diagram: consumer death rate and attack rate. Again, below the black line, consumer extinction. Here, consumer resource cycles. Here, overcompensation cycles. You can see that I've stolen this picture from a different student's work, namely in this case, Yu-Young Du. So the colors are different from the other student who worked with this and chose different colors. I'm sorry about that, but and here I'm comparing different life histories. So on these green lines here, I have a constant level of R0 to compare somehow. Up here, I have a fast life history, so short lifespan, high reproduction. Down here, I have a slow life history, long lifespan, low reproduction. And what you see is typically that the faster life history has more complexity. The slower life history is more like stable, steady states. That's one way to look at these things. There are some other effects of life history. So again, top row is the fast life history, bottom row is the slow life history. But then what makes you life history? In particular, if you think of lifespan, right? Fast life history means you have a higher death rate. This can be in the summer or in the winter, or in both, of course, right? But we've separated it. So this is when summer mortality high, this is when winter mortality is high. And now different things happen. Because if I'm making the summer longer, this direction, in this case, the mortality also goes up. In this case, the mortality goes down. The overall mortality goes down, right? And so all of a sudden you notice that there are more and more things that interact. So that's part of what I said at the beginning. Yes, it's nice to write down just a Lotka-Volterra system. You get some very broad statements out of that. But when you dig into the details, you find, okay, now I have to make a decision here. Now I have to make a life cycle. What am I? And so it becomes more specialized, but also you can start to differentiate things. So in this case, if the fast life history is because of a high summer mortality, well, you get something, but it's still relatively stable. You get 2 cycles. That's about the worst you get. If the winter mortality is high, then a longer summer has a benefit of having more resources and a disadvantage of having higher mortality. So now you can get chaotic systems here. This is a different kind of plot. This is not a bifurcation diagram. And there's a lot of stuff hidden in these plots. So I'm going to try and slow down a bit. So here, what we've done here is what I said earlier. We apply a sinusoidal temperature curve for the year, and we have the mean temperature go up or down, which makes our summer longer or shorter. But because we have something like a temperature, we know how much the temperature increases or decreases. Now, of course, all how much, but still. And then we put in what I said earlier. So the juveniles react differently. Here, the winter mortality increases for adults and decreases for juveniles, right? Because of this metabolic rate thing that I mentioned earlier. So now you can ask, it's good for the adults, it's not so good for juveniles, or the other way around. What's the overall effect? Is the positive effect on the one stage stronger, or the positive effect on the other stage? So in this case, I have the adult density as a function of season length. And if I only think of length and not of differential mortality, I get the black line. So the longer the season length, the higher the adult density. But if I put in the additional winter either increased or decreased mortality, I get the colorful lines. There are different assumptions about how the relationship is. So these are just 4 qualities. The overall thing that I want you to focus on is the black line is increasing, the other lines are decreasing. So if we make season length longer only, this model for these parameters predicts the adults are doing better, or the population overall is doing better. But if we put the differential mortality in, it turns out it's decreasing. And so in that case, the temperature decreases, the temperature increases in the adult mortality is stronger than the decrease in the juvenile mortality. In this case, it turned out that's all the 4 different gave the same prediction. So, and I think it's not just life histories in general, the parameters you choose. Okay. So far, a year is a year is a year. Summer is the same for our species. Winter is the same for all species. That's clearly not true for all consumer resource interactions. Let's change that in the model too. So when it's summer, when it's winter, can be different for each of the species involved. So now I need two timelines. I have a consumer that reproduces at some point, and then it's active, and then it becomes passive in its winter before it reproduces again. And then I have a resource that becomes active at some point, and then it has its active season, at which at some point it stops, and then it decreases during its winter. So in my last example, this will be the spruce budworm, the larvae coming up in the spring. And typically, balsam fir needles are a little bit later, about 10 days or so later that the needles come out. And then at some point, the spruce budworm go away and the trees can produce more leaves or not. So now out of this, I can get many different possibilities. There are 4 different scenarios. Either the resource can come out first, and then the consumer second, and then the consumer goes into hibernation first, and the resource second, and so on, right? You have 4 possibilities, and they're color-coded. And reproduction happens, for the consumer happens here. And then I can put my equations together. So this is the equation that we've seen at the very beginning of that the Przewski model had. When the consumer is dormant, the resource grows logistically, but the consumer just dies and it doesn't collect any new energy because they're dormant. And the resource is dormant while it decays, and the consumer can't do anything. It can't collect resources because they're dormant. So you get the different things filled up together. So here are 2 sample simulations from this particular scenario here. Within year dynamics, and this is the case where from year to year I have a steady state.
So I can ask you a question
Yeah.
about the equation on the previous slide.
Yeah.
For when the resource is dormant, but the consumer is active versus they're both dormant, what is the difference?
So the consumer can have a different death rate, whether it's active or passive, active or dormant.
Okay.
Yeah. So here in the reddish kind of scenario, reddish part of the year, the resource is active, and you can see the resource grows. The dashed lines here, the resource grows. The consumer still decays, it's dormant here. Then when they're both active in the green part, well, the resource gets consumed, the consumer dies, but the consumer from the end here to the beginning here has increased. That's where the birth pulse happened. And so then they're both passive or both dormant, and then again, the resource grows when the consumer is not yet eating it, and then the consumer jumps for its birth pulse. So within a year, you get these 4 different dynamics. From year to year, you can get the same level, then you have a steady state. You watch next year, you come back next year, it's the same. Or you can have a periodic orbit in this case where you get these kind of waves going. In this case, I have a 4 cycle, not 4 cycle, I have a period of 4. It turns out that even with this extension, we can still explicitly write down the discrete maps from one year to the next. And they look horrible. And these will not be on the example. In some of these cases, but unfortunately not all, we can again explicitly solve for the steady states. Why is this important for me? Well, 1, because I'm a mathematician and like to have explicit formulas. 2, because it makes all simulations faster. And if I can explicitly put these in, rather than have to simulate long enough so that I find the steady state, and I can only do that when it's stable. When it's unstable, then I have to have root finding procedures, which are okay, but don't always work. The other thing is when I have explicit expression, I have immediately proof that it's a unique steady state. I don't have 2 or 3 or whatever coexistent state, like these kinds of things. Another thing I can do is I can much more easily evaluate stability. I have an explicit expression for consumer extinction. So if the consumer attack rate is lower than this horrible expression, then they will not survive. So I can write these things down, and then I still can't see anything. I still have to plot them as a function of certain parameters to see which is increasing and decreasing. But in principle, I could do that. And all that work came out of a master's thesis that Sarah wrote and finished about 4 months ago. So then what can you do with this? Same idea again, we have a consumer death rate and we have an attack rate. We have the extinction of the consumer, we have the stable coexistence. Here we have the consumer resource cycles, here we have the overcompensation cycles. And now what we do is we keep the resource emergence day fixed and make the consumer emergence earlier and earlier in the year. So if we make the consumer earlier, then, then we're going in the direction that the arrows here go. What does that mean? Well, what happens if the consumer comes out earlier and earlier? Well, all that time, the consumer is alive, is active, but the resource isn't there yet. So there's an increasing risk for the consumer to die. That's why it needs a higher attack rate to even enter the system. And that's why it needs a higher attack rate to destabilize the system, right? At the same time, it turns out that smaller death rates are required to find the overcompensation cycles. That has to do with the fact that a higher death rate already induces the ability of the consumer to quickly drop, right? Overcompensation cycles is up, down, up, down. So you need to be able to quickly drop. And if we have additional death at the beginning of the year, we don't need it later to get to these cycles. If the resource emerges earlier, we can do the same thing. So now we keep the consumer fixed and we put the resource earlier. And then what happens is that this goes down, this goes up, and these cycles surprisingly come down. So this is now more prone to overcompensation cycles and less prone to consumer resource cycles. So again, we have some kind of very general theoretical ecology insights that said, okay, under some conditions, we get more stable oscillations. Under other conditions, we get more, what would that be? Eruptive type oscillations, up, down, alternating things. So it's that kind of stuff that you can do with a model that's more specific than a Lotka-Volterra model, but still more general than would apply to any particular set of species. Here we have different bifurcation diagram. I don't know if we want to go through this in all detail. Instead of having the consumer death rate, I now have the difference in emergence time. So on this side, the consumer emerges earlier. The consumer emerges later. On this side, the consumer emerges earlier, and we can go through the entire range here. And so now you can look at, okay, what happens if they emerge at the same time? Maybe that's what has evolved historically. And now climate change throws this off, and maybe in the future, the consumer comes in later, or maybe it comes earlier, and then you can try to gauge what would happen to the system. And I'm not going to go into details. I'm just telling you, this is one of the powers that one can use this framework for. So at the beginning, I told you about this biology cushion that talked about the larvae, and they need food, and if there's a match, then that should be good for the population. If there's a mismatch, maybe it shouldn't. So this is an illustration from this paper by Karuba and Volkovich that illustrates the same idea. The resource dashed, the consumer solid. This is a mismatch, the consumer is too early. This is a mismatch, the consumer is too late. This is a match that should be the perfect thing for the consumer. This has since, I don't know if Cushion termed it that way, but it has since been termed the match-mismatch hypothesis. And it makes a lot of sense when you just hear, sure, yeah. If I have the most resources when I need them, that's great. It turns out that it's incredibly difficult to verify that, or to test this hypothesis. And this is what that paper is about. Because what does it mean to have an energy need? When is the energy need of a consumer actually the highest? When they reproduce? and they try to get enough food for the winter, but when is it the highest, and how do you measure it? And then the same for the resource. When is it available? How available is it? And what do you measure in terms of your target function? Is it the per capita growth rate? Is it the total density? What is it, right? So these guys argue that there are very few, if at all, any papers that actually test this hypothesis in terms of experiments. One paper that tried to do something with it by a numerical experiment is this by Rivilla. What they did is they said, okay, what we want as our target variable is the consumer density at steady state. We want, is that high or low? That's our target variable. And what do we have? We say the resource and the consumer each emerge at potentially different times. So we have two distributions, and we take the mean of these two distributions, or the difference in the mean, as the match or the mismatch. And so here you have the consumer emerge earlier, the resource emerge later, the consumer produces eggs, the resource produces seeds, and that's what is the next year's consumer and resource population. So here the consumer emerges earlier and produces quite a few eggs. Here the consumer and resource emerge pretty much at the same time, and the consumer production is fairly low. And here the consumer, again, emerges a lot later than the resource, but has a fairly high density of eggs at the end of the year. So what happens is that when the difference in emergence time is close to 0, then the consumer density is the lowest. When it's higher, positive or negative, the consumer density is higher. So this is from, all these plots are from their paper there. And that's kind of surprising, right? The resource does exactly what you expect. It gets exploited more, so it has a lower dip. But this lower dip doesn't come with a peak in the consumer. It comes with a dip in the consumer. Why would that? So what they said is that this is overexploitation. There are just too many consumers there that the resource can't produce it, can't sustain it anymore. So they have resource and consumer both experience these kind of emergence distributions. We have a consumer that appears at a single peak and a resource that's constantly available. So let's say, we said, let's try this. Let's try the same thing. So down here, we have the difference in emergence time. So when does the consumer start its birth pulse? When does the resource start its growth phase? Here, the consumer is later. Here, the consumer is earlier. And then this is the resource density. This is the consumer density. So what we see for the resource is exactly the pattern that we saw before. When they emerge at the same time, the resource has indeed, most of the resource is consumed. What we see for the consumer, well, it depends on its attack rate. If the attack rate is low, dark color here, then indeed having synchrony emerging at the same time as when the resource starts growing is the best for the consumer. It's got the highest density. If the attack rate is high, however, we get this other pattern that we had just seen in the Rivilla paper. So again, yes, overexploitation can make this dip here. And it doesn't necessarily have to be there. Like if the alpha is if the attack rate of the consumer is low enough, then indeed synchrony is better. Okay. What's the time, or rather, how much time do I still have?
It's 12:50. Yeah, 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Do I really have 10 minutes from everybody? Okay. Then let me talk about this other end. So all you've seen so far were write them down differential equations, semi-discrete systems, try to do analysis, try to find bifurcation diagrams. Let's come from the other side. Let's start with the real system. Even if the equations get really complicated, we don't mind. We'll just push through them by numerics. Spruce budworm, balsam fir. Spruce budworm has these regular outbreaks. This is the percentage of affected trees. And if they are affected, they're massively affected. If you've lived in Ontario, in Quebec for long enough, you probably know about that. Because there are outbreaks going on. This is from 2017. All the red is area strongly defoliated by spruce budworm. So what happens here and why is it related to the stuff I'm talking about? Spruce budworm starts with eggs and larvae in the late summer. Then there is a diapause. And then in the spring, they emerge at some point. They develop into pupae, adults, eggs, and we start over. The balsam fir also rest in the winter. They have a bud burst at a certain time. And that's where the young, juicy, soft green needles are there. And that's what the spruce budworm larvae can and want to eat. That's very nutritious. And then the needles age, and the older they get, the less interested the budworm are, or the less nutritious they are. So we can ask the question about synchrony and mismatch at precisely this point. How do we do this? So when do the budworm emerge and when do the trees put out their leaves? Well, I'm going to pull from different parts of the literature. So there's this heat accumulation model that says I have a temperature x of t. And at a certain temperature, a certain amount of heat gets accumulated. This is somehow counting how many days have there been that it's been over so and so many degrees. And then this organism is collecting heat. And if it has collected enough heat, it can sum that up. It has collected enough heat. That's the time when the emergence happens. So this is heat collection. This is the target value. When I get the target, that's the time when the larvae get active or the bud burst happens, right? So now I can connect the temperature time series to the timing of emergence from my winter resting period. I'm not yet at the point where I connect this to population dynamics. I'm just looking at timing when this happens. So I have a consumer, I have a resource, they have these kind of accumulation rates. I have a temperature at lower latitude or with global change, it's higher. At higher latitude without global change, it's lower. So now I can look at the accumulation rate of the consumer under these two temperature regimes. And I can look at the accumulated quantity, and now it gets a little bit complicated. So in this case, the resource would shift from here to there, and the consumer would shift from here to there under these two scenarios. And so what used to be the mismatch here, now before climate change, now turns into that mismatch. So they both shift, but they might shift at different rates, and so the mismatch changes. We've run biosim climate simulations at these selected locations in Eastern Canada. We ran these times in 4 hours, so we sampled the temperatures in 4-hour time intervals. That turns out to be the best. So daily average temperature is not a good idea. And temperature by less than an hour intervals is computationally crazy. This turned out to be a good thing. And so we predicted the emergence date based on the previous mechanisms and then calculated the mismatch. So what you get are things like this. Depending on latitude, the emergence state of the caterpillar and the bud burst state of the tree. The blue is under no climate change, and then the red is under different scenarios of climate change. And you see everything is earlier. This is day of the year. Everything is earlier. That's what we observe. That's what we expect. It gets warmer. They accumulate heat faster, so they come out earlier. What does the mismatch do? It turns out that the mismatch also, well, in this case, decays. It goes from -5 days, or -6 days. So the bud burst is about 5 to 6 days early to it be about 10 to 12 days earlier at southern latitudes. At northern latitudes, it goes from being maybe 3 days earlier to maybe about 5 days earlier. So here, the northern latitudes in the future climate will have the same mismatch as the southern latitudes now. That would mean we expect roughly the same dynamics further north that we have in the south now, give or take. How do we put all of this into a population dynamic model? That's really complicated because one of the most detailed budworm models is from 1974 and contains 78 equations. Because they have an equation for every tree age, 10-year-old tree, 11-year-old tree, 12-year-old tree, everything. But the model exists and has been parameterized. And one of the things it has a budworm survival rate in here. And this is where the mismatch come in, because we also have found a paper that says the mismatch has this kind of quadratic relationship to survival. So we picked this, plugged it in here, and ran our simulations of this complicated model with the time series that I showed you earlier. And I want to just point out one thing here, and not everything on this slide. So a typical budworm cycle looks like this. You have the branch surface area in blue, which tells you how much forest there is. You have the susceptible trees, again, tells you how much forest there is, so in red. So the susceptible trees go up, the branch surface area goes up. Now you have the ideal situation where the budworm can thrive. And so the larval density of the budworm shoots up here. They clear all the trees of leaves. And after a very short period of time, after a couple of years, the trees go down and the branch surface area goes down. So classical consumer research stuff. And then the budworm almost goes away. And it takes for a long time for both the surface area and the trees to recover, and then the budworm can come up again. What we have found now is if the timing is just right, that you have a couple of bad winters or bad mismatches, then something like here, an outbreak is about to happen, but the larval density doesn't reach quite as high. A couple of bad winters here with bad mismatch. And so the larvae decline before the branches are completely gone, before the trees are completely gone. So this forest remains kind of susceptible, and you get a second outbreak much shorter than what you typically expect after first. So things become more unstable in that sense, less predictable. So we looked at just frequencies, ran this over many years, look at frequencies, and outbreaks happen, what do you see? It's a little bit more yellow down here than it is here. So the differences, you see, dark red is pretty much no difference, but the dark blue means you can get minus 30, minus 35 years in difference in the cycle. So typically in the south, you get shorter outbreaks, but they're more irregular. So I started with these semi-discrete models to get an idea of how to put phenology into some of these models. Those are new models. The right-hand sides we couldn't have guessed by just writing down standard things. We really need the semi-discrete part. We really need the ODE part in the middle to tell us what's happening. More detail and more variability. What's the interesting mathematics? Well, some things we can solve explicitly. That's always a hooray effect. Yeah, we could do it. There's more complex dynamics. There are other things that I haven't shown you about this very basic model. For example, I suspect there is a case of bistability between a steady state and a 3 cycle in the model, but I don't know how to prove that. So there are a couple of interesting dynamical things that we can see numerically, but I'm not sure. Is there interesting biology? I think so. It allows us to put a lot of stuff into this model. Something I haven't pointed out, but if you remember that original model had a bilinear functional response. So in an ODE model, bilinear functional response, all you get is steady state dynamics, nothing else. But with this additional semi-discrete structure, you get consumer research cycles, overcompensation cycles, everything. Right, so the old tenet that if you want to see consumer research cycles, you have to put a Holling type 2 functional response in there. It's out the window. Not necessary. We have put competition in. I heard somebody's in the audience who works on coexistence of competing consumers. So we have done that in that system here as well, and we can get 10, 20 species coexist on a single resource. What are the challenges? Well, for every different life cycle, we have to make a different model now. That's a little bit annoying, and it limits the generality of things that we can say. I currently have a student who wants to work on optimal control of outbreaks. So take this model system, this equation system, and put the theory of optimal control to work. So make another connection with mathematics. What I'd really like to do is integrate energy budget models with this, because that will be the final connection then from temperature to rates to population dynamics to scaling up. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Yin Du, Sarah Abel, Sebastian Portalier, and my collaborator at NRC, Jean-Noël Kondo. I'm here for the whole day, and I'm happy to give you other references if you're interested. Thanks for listening.
Questions?
I see two, yes.
Yeah, so your semi-discrete model is basically your pulses are discrete, right? But they're not discrete in nature. They're distributed. How
Yes,
are you testing that, planning? Okay,
that totally should, yes.
okay.
So-
And
That's another challenge here. So what I hear you say is they don't really reproduce on a single day.
Yeah.
Right? They reproduce on say 2 weeks. How important is it to really put this exact structure of the emergence times in compared to just reducing it to 1? Because like this model here, where are they? There. This model here does have indeed these emergent time distribution explicitly, and then all of the analytical solutions go out the window.
Mhm.
So how important is it? Good question. I haven't tested it yet, but it's something, yes, that I want to test. My best guess is the stronger the separation timescale, the better the approximation is.
there's also some, I mean, it's just something to just look at basically how large the time scale, how long is the separation from your point model, how much it matters on your nonlinear functions. So
Yeah.
That's very, I just want to see that idea. Okay.
Yeah, that would be really good to see, and I haven't done it yet.
We can alternate to, so Anmar online has a question. Go ahead, Anmar.
Very interesting talk, Frithjof. I mean, as you may know, that's not my area of expertise, but it intrigued something that I've read a while ago. This is your idea about match and mismatch. I read an article many years ago about Tasmanian devil. They have this disease. They call it the facial tumor disease, which basically infects these animals when they're like 2-year-olds. And they were worried about the population of this animal, that it might bring it to extinction because they were dying really early. But they realized recently that these animals have adapted, and that's where my question is about adaptation. So their reproductive cycle actually adapted to have babies even earlier, to basically to survive under these disease conditions. So here's my question for you. I mean, wouldn't this also adaptation or evolution be involved in this mismatch where the species could basically try to deal with that mismatch?
Yes, absolutely. So this paper here does put evolution into the model. And there are many models that look at plant pollinator phenology. And again, the evolution of the plant flowering time, and the pollinator emergence time, that exists. They are usually all simulation models, the ones I know of, but yeah. We have started with my group to put a little bit of evolution in there, but if any of the students here or elsewhere wants to work on that, great, I'm happy to collaborate.
Okay, all right. Thanks.
Yeah, evolution of these things would be interesting.
I had 2 questions, and one of them I think is just a bit of perhaps a confusion. But in the practical case, it seems like what we're worried about is the extinction or the deforestation that's happening because of these larvae. In all the models, when you talk about the different states that happen, you're worried about the consumer extinction rather than the resource extinction. So I'm just wondering like why the focus of those graphs are kind of different, like they seem misaligned.
Between the bifurcation diagrams and the last part of the talk.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. That's just
the way it is.
Yeah, so there are different things going on in my research. Like the spruce budworm thing was one part that came in collaboration with Natural Resources Canada. And then there was the interest in the theory part. And on some part, they inform each other, but they don't necessarily ask the same question. Absolutely, you're right.
And would you have to reparameterize it in order to look at the resource extinction, or is it just a matter of the way? I don't know what, I've never done a bifurcation myself, so I don't know what that is.
So resource extinction is usually not the problem. Even in the spruce budworm model, I mean, yes, the trees will die if they have several years of defoliation, and then the spruce budworm will go away. And historically, like for last, I don't know, 1,000 or so years, they go away for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and then they show up again. I don't think anybody is concerned about extinction of balsam fir, at least not from spruce budworm, right? Maybe from climate change, but not from spruce budworm. The question there is a question of forest management. If you have large swaths of balsam fir gone, like this is a lot of loss of timber, loss of revenue, so how do you protect them? So that's why we want to approach that with an optimal control problem, say, okay, what do we have to do to manage for, let's say, make sure that we have at least so and so much resources there every year, so and so much many trees that can be harvested for whatever it is that we want.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second question I had is more like how much intuition you can have for these models. I know you said it's a challenge with different life cycles, but like oak trees, they'll have masting years where they produce a ton of acorns, like maybe one every 4 years. And so they're not on an annual period where it kind of varies. Is that something that you can just kind of assume, oh, it'll be more like, I don't know, chaotic, or is that you just have to kind of look through and simulate it?
I guess I'm on the cautious side of this. I have seen too many predictions, simple sounding predictions go wrong. So I would say, let me think about this before I make a prediction. Yes, you get more or less chaos. But typically I would say, like, if the more irregular you input it, the more irregular your output should be. But famous last words, yeah. I'm not sure who was first.
So my question about the first part, it's a semi-discrete model.
Yeah.
So my question is like, a lot of people, they use like the purely continuous model, or the explicitly impulsive like events to represent those like the in a very short time, the instant events. So what do you think are the bias they will make, like compared with the semi-discrete model?
So you mean compare this to those two?
Yeah.
So I think the comparison to this one is fairly easy, because in the end, what I have is a model like that. But in contrast to this, I know exactly which parameter goes where and how it affects these numbers. Right? So I have a lot more control over the details in my model, or Przewski et al. Did, than if you just write down this model. So I think that part of the answer is easy. The other part is not so easy. That's the question of how precise a model of the life cycle that you want to model do you get. Okay. I get something that has a birth pulse in the consumer and a continuously reproducing resource. And this is something where the consumer and the resource both reproduce continuously. Most systems are probably somewhere in between. And so it comes back to the question that you had about relative timescales. How long does the consumer have as a reproductive period, these kind of things. And then maybe in microcosms, this is perfectly fine because you don't have.
I mean, like the instant event for my question, it's like biology, it's really an instant event. So I want to model it.
Mhm.
But for these models, I think like either they're discrete or the continuous, it's like not real. So like what are the barriers they make compared with your models?
What are the
Like the purely
errors?
discrete or purely continuous compared with your models? Like, what are the disadvantages they make?
Disadvantages?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you said they're somewhat less realistic, right? And that is a disadvantage. Huge advantages, I can much more easily analyze it. It's like, yes, that's your trade-off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk more later.
Yeah, sure.
You
There
would.
were 2 more questions here.
Go ahead, Lawrence.
So this could maybe be thought of as in parallel to Amber's question. To what extent do you think sort of chasing an optimal mismatch could drive spatial dynamics? As opposed to like the population evolving, it's chasing in space. Like, so if one species is more affected by seasonal changes than the other, maybe the other one moves to where.
I haven't thought about that at all. That's an interesting question. I have not thought about that. Yeah. Are you here around later today?
Yeah.
I'd like to talk more about that.
So a lot of these models, I think all of them are two species models. So
Yeah.
your 2 things are strongly coupled, and you get this really interesting phase diagram, bifurcation diagram. And I'm wondering, is there a way that you can kind of, I don't know, kind of like artificially apply some damping to it to kind of be like, okay, what if this were in a larger system where they're maybe not so strongly coupled, and like, what parts of this bifurcation diagram are kind of more sensitive to not having the strong coupling between them? And like,
So even in a classical blood couple Terra type system, I wouldn't know the answer to your question.
Mhm. Sure.
Because we're assuming a specialist predator
Mhm.
and its prey. And we know that generalist predators have very different effects on. So in some sense, I guess you're asking, can I put this into a network context? I have a network of interacting species, and I do something like this.
Sort of, or I guess sort of, is there kind of like, I don't know, like I guess sensitivity analysis sort
Yeah.
of thing, like how vulnerable are some of these results to less strong coupling?
Less strong coupling. Yeah, I don't know that. I have done one resource and many consumers, competing consumers, but they're all strongly coupled.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Let's give our speaker a well-deserved break and thank him for his talk. Great talk.
Thank you.